All right, thank you everyone for coming. We're a small instrument crew, so I don't know if you want it. You don't have to move up, but if you'd like to move up and be a little closer, that would be great. My name's Kelly Vodden. We're going to each introduce ourselves first here, and then we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves as well, just so we get a bit of a sense of who's in the room and what regions of Canada you might be coming from. So, okay, so my name is Kelly Vodden. I'm a professor with the Environmental Policy Institute and Associate Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies at Grenfell campus from Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. My research focused on rural community and regional development and governance. Together with Dr. Ashley Consolo from the Labrador Institute, also with Memorial University, I'm co-lead of the Rural and Remote Communities chapter in the Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge National Assessment, Advancing Our Knowledge Story for Action National Assessment that we're here to discuss with you today. My other two panelists introduce themselves and then I'll go around the room.
My name's Sean Manners. I'm a graduate student at Memorial University, and I'm affiliated with the Environmental Policy Institute there as a research assistant. I have a background in environmental ethics, political science, and environmental policy, and my role with this project is to assist Dr. Vodden and Dr. Consolo in coordinating the chapter, as well as co-authoring.
Hi, my name is Amy Kipp, and I'm a research associate at the University of Guelph, and I work with Dr. Grenfell and Dr. Shirley Herbert. And I have a background in international development and human geography. And the research that I work on with Doctors Herbert and Grenfell focuses on how climate change is influencing health and well-being and Indigenous health adaptations to climate change. So Dr. Harper and Grenfell have brought me on to help with research and looking at the chapter.
We're going to tell you about what we're doing with the chapter and what we've learned so far. And I guess I'll start actually with giving the background on that note of the purpose of the panel. I'm standing because when I sit, I can't see everybody, so behind the podium here. So for over a decade, NRCan's Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division has led the development of national and sectoral science assessments that assess and synthesize the growing knowledge on climate change impacts and adaptation for Canadians, working with expertise in government, but also with universities and non-government organizations. These are intended to be current, accessible, relevant sources of information to help Canadians respond to climate change. The assessments began with the 2008 publication, From Impacts to Adaptation, Canada in a Changing Climate. There was a 2014 update, and now we have this process that we're involved in now in 2018. There's also been some targeted reports on climate change sensitivity, risks and adaptation along Canada's marine coasts, and others, risks associated with the transportation sector. Then there are other agencies like Health Canada and the Canadian Forest Service have done their own assessments in particular sectors as well, which we are trying to draw from as much as we can in our work. Together with other federal departments, Environment and Climate Change Canada is now leading the development of Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action report. And we are here to discuss our role in that report and the Rural and Remote Communities chapter. The process began in 2016 and will be finalized in late 2018 in terms of the drafting, but then there'll be a process also of review and comment on the chapter. There will be a series of related reports, some of these and chapters, including national issues chapters and regional chapters. So there's a large authorship team. So we have leads for each chapter as well as contributing authors. So each chapter has a large list of contributors, including case studies and chapter authors, or variously large, but certainly a number of authors in each area. So we have a prairies chapter, for example, and then we have issues chapters like the Rural and Remote Communities chapter and Urban Communities chapter, and then others such as a water chapter. There's an international issues and a series of others. The recent October 6th UN special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius was timely, so it's been a lot of media attention once again to issues of climate change and the urgency of addressing these issues. And that report also talked about that there were certain populations that are disproportionately higher risk of adverse consequences of global warming. at 1.5 degrees Celsius and beyond, including disadvantaged and vulnerable populations, some indigenous groups, and local communities dependent on agricultural or coastal livelihoods. You can state this with high confidence. Those communities are often rural and remote communities here in Canada. So these regions are disproportionately higher risk, and they include Arctic ecosystems, dryland regions, and also small island developing states, but also our own island and coastal communities here in Canada. So it's just helps to emphasize the importance of this national effort with this recent report. So I'm going to hand it over to Sean, and he'll talk a little bit about how we're defining rural and remote.
Right, so upon being chosen to work on this chapter, our first task was really to define what is rural and remote. And to this end, we worked closely with the urban chapter in an attempt to come up with a definition that would make sense for both chapters and allow for all communities to be captured. So our definition of rural and small town consists of two criteria. First, it was if it was self-identified by the community, or if the author identified that community as being rural or small town. And secondly, it's a population living outside of a labor force commuting zone. So where 50% or more of the residents commute out of 10,000 people. The urban chapter, however, is focusing on communities of 30,000 or more, which is covering medium and large population centers according to recent Statistics Canada definitions of population centers. Now, we recognize that this leaves the outstanding question about those communities between 10 and 30,000 classified as small population centers and where they would fit in this assessment. So your comments on whether these are smaller these smaller population centers are rural or urban would be greatly appreciated and welcome. Our definition for remote refers to no MIZ areas where the population is 10,000 or greater, where the population is 10,000, but no residents commute to an urban location for work. And this includes the territories. We also just wanted to highlight that many of the remote communities are northern and often indigenous. So our approach to gathering information we've used three approaches. First, we did a scoping literature review, collaboration with other chapters, and then consultation with stakeholders. So the first step in our approach has been to conduct a scoping literature review in order to collate some of the available information regarding rural and remote communities in Canada with respect to climate change impacts, exposure, risk, vulnerability, sensitivity, and adaptation. To do this, we crafted a research question which asks, what is the extent, range, and nature of peer-reviewed literature on climate change and adaptation in rural and remote communities in Canada? After we came up with our research question, we then created two scoping protocols around this question, one for peer-reviewed literature and one for gray literature, utilizing different databases, but we maintain the same search strength. Once we had all of our articles and publications collected, two independent reviewers screened them according to our inclusion criteria, which left us with 71 peer-reviewed articles and 26 gray literature publications, and additional documents. Well, we expect additional documents will be added based on continual expert and stakeholder consultation. So by no means is our preliminary scoping review the final basis on which we are making our key messages or key themes. Yeah, so I would also like to emphasize that this has been an ongoing process, and the scoping literature review was limited to articles and gray literature published only between 2014 and 2017. The point of that was because the last federal assessment was in 2014, and so we were hoping to create more of a current state of knowledge based on the scoping review. And as we move forward with the chapter, we will be expanding the breadth of literature that we draw on to incorporate more diverse perspectives that were not captured in our first scoping review. Some key highlights out of our preliminary findings from our scoping review is that about 50% of the captured articles are actually from the north, meaning about only 30 articles were from non-northern communities. And other than the territories, BC and Quebec were the most highly represented. In terms of social modifiers, we also invested social modifiers mentioned in the articles, and age emerged most frequently, which we suspect is due to the fact that on average, rural communities have aging populations, and this would further enhance their vulnerability to a changing climate. Our next step in information gathering was to collaborate with other chapters. And so to this end, it's been really important for us to reach out to our colleagues on the regional and more thematic chapters in order to avoid duplicating work, but also to make sure that our chapters obviously complement each other. And so to this extent, our collaboration has been an ongoing process. And in terms of our collaboration with the other chapters, we coordinate and participate in meetings organized by the leads of other chapters, but also as well as meetings of the entire assessment team. So for example, just last week, myself and Dr. Consolo were in Ottawa meeting with the rest of the assessment team. In terms of consultation, we've participated in a number of events so far. A 2-day workshop on building climate resilience. Climate change, we hosted a workshop at the Climate Change Symposium on coastal communities in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we've attended an event led by the Atlantic team called the Coastal Zone Canada. There have also been regional efforts where we gather feedback from the processes that the regional chapters have worked on, for instance, Quebec or the Prairies. If they have any insights, literature, connections, we coordinate with them. And then we also plan to consult with additional national level organizations such as the FCM and the ITK.
Awesome. So as Sean mentioned, today we will be sharing some of our initial results that we found based on the scoping review of the academic and grey literature related to climate change in rural and remote communities across Canada. So I just wanted to emphasize that there's a great deal of diversity in and amongst rural and remote communities that's been seen throughout this conference. And what we're discussing today is just an initial snapshot of some of the issues faced by some communities. So with that said, we hope that the broad overview we'll be presenting will help spark some discussion to inform the writing of this national assessment on climate change. So from our scoping review, 6 key themes have emerged, and we're going to spend the next hour or so exploring these themes and discussing the impacts of climate change on rural and remote communities with regard to health and well-being, infrastructure and transportation, economy and livelihoods, identity, culture and society, governance and institutions, as well as various adaptation strategies and resiliencies and the interconnectedness of these different themes. So again, as Sean highlighted, a key part of informing the national assessment is hearing from people who are from, conduct research in, and work for organizations in rural and remote communities. So I think we have a pretty good sampling of that in here. So after each key theme is talked about by us, we want to hear your perspectives about these issues. And so during the we'll provide some discussion questions as a starting point, and we'll provide an opportunity to discuss the specific topic as a group. So we've passed around handouts, so feel free to take notes on those handouts as we go through. And then at the end of our panel, you can submit that paper to us, and we'll use that to inform the writing of the assessment as well. So just to quickly highlight the questions that we will be discussing so that you can keep them in mind as we go through the different themes. So number 1, are the issues that we are reviewing reflective of those that your region, community, or organization has experienced? What kind of adaptations to climate change have you seen to these issues, particularly those that are innovative and or from which lessons might be learned? Are there challenges to adaptation related to these issues that you are aware of? What other adaptation opportunities may exist? And are there any key points related to this theme that have not been mentioned? So I'm going to begin this overview of the key themes by highlighting some of what the literature says regarding climate change and health and well-being in rural and remote communities. So the literature we reviewed emphasized that climate change is indeed impacting the health and well-being of those residing in rural and remote communities in Canada in many ways, which differ greatly between different contexts. So the ability to access nourishing and preferred food and water source is key to food and water security and subsequently health outcomes. The literature we reviewed highlights that many Indigenous communities, as well as some rural communities, have experienced changing access and quality of existing sources of food and water. For example, in Brigalet-Nunatsiavut has experienced changing water quality and accessibility associated with environmental changes. Limited supply of fresh water in small remote communities is impacting ability to drink preferred water sources and is adding to financial barriers to household. Food insecurity and environmental contaminants in food have also been linked to climate change. Specifically in Arctic areas, research has revealed an increase in environmental contaminants and toxic heavy metals within food and water sources. So as the accessibility of country food and local crops shift as a result of changing climatic conditions, rural and remote communities may have to rely more heavily on store-bought food, which is often much less nutritious. So chronic illness and disease has also been associated with climate change and is often linked to changes to food and water accessibility and quality. So increasing levels of environmental contaminants cause a number of health concerns. Water insecurity has been associated with numerous individuals and public health concerns, chronic disease, such as chronic disease management, gastrointestinal illness, food insecurity, and more. And higher rates of respiratory and skin infection have also been associated with the lack of in-home water service. So, and additionally, reliance on store-bought food is often connected to increased rates of diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. The reviewed literature also highlighted the potential health effects of an increase in extreme weather, as well as rapidly changing environmental conditions. Extreme weather conditions may include winter storms, droughts, tornadoes, heat waves, which may result in forest fires, and increase in the number of heat waves experienced in rural communities increases risk of injury due to heat stroke and respiratory issues, which are often connected to increased prevalence of forest fire smoke. Droughts may lead to enhanced issues with food and water security. Again, storms may result in flooding and the erosion of coastlines, damaging public and private infrastructure such as hospitals, and limiting access to health services. And as the climate changes in rural and remote areas, the mental health and well-being of individuals is also affected. As resources change and people are forced to adapt to new, often less desirable conditions. The impacts of climate change on mental health may be influenced by reduced access to traditional territory, as well as stress related to environmental changes and loss. Additionally, the changes to historic and current food and water sources may also impact the mental health and well-being of individuals. Familiar and sacred resources undergo rapid change. So although the literature we reviewed mainly examined mental health and well-being in the context of remote Indigenous communities in the North, there may also be similar impacts in rural communities across Canada. So it's important to note that the literature also explored adaptation strategies that some rural and remote communities have enacted with regard to health and well-being, as well as potential opportunities for future adaptation. These strategies and opportunities show the strength and resilience within communities and include, but of course are not limited to, drawing from and focusing on experience-based and local knowledge, such as community-based environmental monitoring and knowledge of different resources. Engaging people across social categories to develop new adaptation and mitigation strategies is also considered to be important. Developing a healthy, actively involved, and resilient population can contribute to fostering healthy communities and a healthy future. And there is a continued need and opportunity for coordinated public health response plans at rural and remote levels to promote awareness of health and well-being issues associated with the changing climate.
Great that infrastructure has been brought up because that's our next key theme. Across Canada, rural and remote communities are facing significant challenges posed by climate change to both their critical and community infrastructure. While climatic impacts are variable across regions, critical infrastructure such as electricity lines, pipelines, roads, sewage systems, as well as cultural facilities are being negatively affected from coast to coast to coast. As extreme weather events such as flooding and icing, coastal erosion, permafrost melt are also placing increased pressure on communities to begin incorporating climate change into municipal planning and building codes. So, community versus critical infrastructure. The literature distinguishes between two types of infrastructure. Community infrastructure, such as municipal buildings, recreational facilities, schools, and critical infrastructure such as electricity lines, pipelines, telecommunications, and when it comes to rural and remote communities, however, it becomes more difficult to make this distinction between critical and community infrastructure, usually because there has been greater importance given to damage to critical infrastructure, such as the energy lines and telecommunication centers, which are indeed important. However, literature doesn't seem to fully address the fact that community infrastructure failure, such as losing a recreational facility or damage to a school, can actually be equally as devastating to a community as much as the loss of something that would be considered critical infrastructure, because these buildings often have multiple uses and contribute greatly to the social reproduction of the communities, and the ability to, and it also needs the ability to respond to extreme weather events. So, for example, which is almost out of the same vein as you were speaking about, a study in 2015 looking at coastal communities, looking at coastal climate change and aging communities in Nova Scotia, found that increases in extreme weather events, such as storm surges, as well as sea level rise, are placing both critical and community infrastructure at risk, but a greater risk to residential properties and public facilities that are relevant to daily life. And these include things like community centers, grocery stores, restaurants, post offices, and this severely impacts the services that the community's aging populations rely on. So how is climate change affecting infrastructure? Well, nationally, it appears that rural and remote communities are experiencing increased precipitation, which is putting pressure on specific infrastructure, such as waste and water management zones. Impacts from extreme weather events have also emerged as a concern for communities due to both the increased intensity and unpredictability of events, such as high winds, ice storms, floods, and heat waves. While there are some similarities at the national level, there are regional differences associated with the impacts to both critical and community infrastructure. So, for example, climate change poses a unique risk to the built environment in Canada's north, where these communities seem to be at particular risk from slower onset climate changes, such as thawing permafrost, which affects access to and the quality of roads, as well as changes in sea ice and coastal erosion. For example, the Mackenzie River serves as an important transportation route for many remote communities, including mining sites during the summer and fall seasons. However, since 2014, major shipping companies have recorded significant changes to the water levels nearer to the northern end of the river, which has actually made it possible for the tug and barge operations to make deliveries to that region. Where southern communities are concerned, literature suggests that there are more rapid onset climate impacts from extreme weather events, causing increased snow loads, precipitation leading to flooding, ice storms, which are all causing damage to more critical infrastructure, which is what the literature goes. Coastal communities seen to be affected by both rapid and slower onset changes or climatic impacts. And in terms of adaptation responses, communities are responding with both mitigation and adaptation approaches. So some communities are beginning to consider updating their practices when designing and having new infrastructure with longer service lives. And in the north, energy retrofits for homes and municipal facilities appears to be a growing trend. Where energy costs are high, it seems that communities are also beginning to shift away from diesel fuel for transportation. And yeah, so I guess this will be a portion for you guys to answer questions on your sheet.
Just sort of a specific example about designing constructing new infrastructure from Newfoundland that if you wanted a specific example, we'd love to hear yours, is larger culverts to help with the flooding damage that happens in extreme weather events. But so across Newfoundland and Labrador, there's been an attempt to try to replace culverts and increase the size of culverts. And also things like municipalities just checking when they know there's a storm coming, checking to make sure that the culverts are debris free when they might not have done that before. So there are some simpler, lower cost things that municipalities can do and have been paying more attention to as well.
Right. And for the protecting of bridges, I read some communities go to, I guess, they put up, I'm not sure what they're called, but like walls on the bridges so that water cannot flow over. It's kind of diverted around. And also in New Brunswick, there was one case study where a community has experimented with moving their houses purposefully higher up compared to all of the other ones, designing them to be taller. Yeah, so those are some examples of how they've been changing or not.
So, okay, so let's move on to just to keep us moving, but at the end, hopefully we'll have a bit more time for any other final comments, but we were a bit late starting. So to shift to livelihoods for a minute. So another sort of key message that we have is that climate change has impacted business, economy, and livelihoods in Canadian rural and remote communities in many ways that are unique to these areas, as well as some shared experiences. As in other cases. Extreme weather events such as drought, heat waves, heavy snow, and precipitation, for example, have negatively influenced the agriculture sector, but also other natural resource sectors in Canada, leading to employment and business uncertainty. We heard a bit about the agricultural threats already here. And subsistence and informal economic activities that are critical to many rural livelihoods are also being threatened and changing as a result of climate changes in climatic conditions. Natural resource sectors and natural resource sector dependent communities, the majority of which fall within rural and remote definitions, are particularly vulnerable and disproportionately impacted by climate change. For example, some of the sectors that have come up in the literature review to date include agricultural, which is in 13.5 of the articles that talk about livelihoods, talk about agricultural threats to agricultural livelihoods. Forestry, you have to talk about forestry as well. Fishing and tourism sectors also come up as important rural livelihood sectors that are affected by climate change. Some examples of that on the subsistence economy side of things, fishing and hunting are impacted by changing ice conditions. There was an example in a recent expert panel on climate change adaptation of Old Crow, Yukon, where a resident talks about, for years, my mother monitored the area and noticed the permafrost thawing in 2007. The lake broke through and I went with it. Along with our fish, the caribou changed their migratory route and the ducks and birds disappeared. The whole of Old Crow Flats is changing very fast due to climate change. And we'll talk about some cultural implications of that as well, because they're very much interlinked. But these traditional food and livelihood practices are definitely being affected. In terms of the more formal economy sectors, in the forest sector, we've seen prevalence of pests, such as the mountain pine beetle incidents in British Columbia, and the forest fires that have affected timber supply, revenues, and employment in the forest sectors. Fisheries, we've seen invasive species that have affected fish species, as well as changes in fish migration that mean that the species that harvesters have traditionally fished are no longer in the area. So this threatens traditional fisheries. It does create new opportunities too when new species of fish or wildlife become available in an area, but that's dependent on those species being available to local people to access. Because often in the fishery, for example, when a new fishery becomes available, there's a fight to sort of get into that new fishery, and often those that access the new fishery might be people with access to more money or information resources that are able to access licenses. So the shifts in species need to be accompanied by some consideration for those that have lost access. Agriculture, heat waves affecting cattle mortality. You mentioned the cattle mortality. There's an article that we came across in Ontario talking about the same thing, heat and cattle mortality. Change in soil moisture and productivity has affected grazing in Saskatchewan, I understand, as well. In Newfoundland and Labrador, tourism example, there's been a loss and erosion of trails and of archaeological sites that are important, and cultural sites that are important for tourism livelihoods. So just some examples of adaptation include monitoring. We've talked about that in other areas as well to increase the adaptive readiness. So there's Indigenous guardian programs, for example. There have been a number of programs such as on-farm manuals to help farmers think about how climate change might affect them, and other kinds of planning efforts that have sought to help with adaptation. Also shifts to new green economies, and we talked about biofuels, and so utilizing some of the waste wood from some of these changing conditions to help with, I guess, mitigating some of the losses in the forest sector, but also helping to think about new fuel sources and shifting to a different kind of economy that is greener and lower carbon, but also helps with the shift out of some of the problems that have been occurring in the traditional sectors.
Okay, so this section focuses on identity, culture, and society, and a lot of the things we've already touched on, but I'm just going to bring them up again to be with this theme. So the way climate change influences identity, culture, and society in rural and remote communities was another important theme. Climate change has influenced and has the potential to continue to influence the identity, culture, and society in rural and remote regions. Further, it's important to consider how identity, culture, and society influence individual and community experience with the effects of climate change and their ability to adapt to these changes. So vulnerability to climate change is determined at a social, cultural, and political level, but experienced by the individual. This experience is determined by individual characteristics such as age, gender, indigeneity, and other aspects of individual identity. So as we talked about, there have been some case studies in Nova Scotia looking at climate change and the effects on aging populations, as well as there have been several studies that look at gender and the way climate change is experienced differently by people identifying as either men or women. So gender has also been cited as a consideration in cultural communities, where a gender division of labor may influence how different gender experience the impact of climate change. Additionally, as mentioned, when discussing health and well-being, identifying as Indigenous may also influence one's experience of climate change, as many Indigenous groups in Canada rely closely on the land for their cultural practices, sustenance, and livelihoods. The review's research also emphasized the various ways climate change is influencing physical markers of culture, as well as shifting cultural practices. For example, in many Arctic regions, the effects of climate change, such as falling permafrost, erosion, and flooding, are damaging heritage and archaeological sites associated with Indigenous culture. Additionally, in coastal regions, coastal erosion resulting from storm surges, sea level rise, and loss of sea ice is impacting and surfing routes and areas. Further environmental change has also been associated with decreased transmission of environmental, Indigenous, and local knowledge and skill sharing with younger generations. The existing research also highlights the connection between socioeconomic status, education, and climatic impacts. Research from several studies found that higher poverty and unemployment rates, as well as lower levels of educational attainment in rural and remote communities, can exacerbate the effects of climate change and decrease community and individual adaptive capacity. Social vulnerability to climate change is dependent on aspects such as a lack of access to resources, social capital, and poor infrastructure. So further challenging socioeconomic conditions, such as issues associated with public health, can be negatively influenced by climate change, resulting in negative impacts for health and economy of communities. So again, we see the interconnectedness of these themes. The literature also explored adaptation strategies, and a couple of those include incorporating local Indigenous knowledge into adaptation strategies. positively influence community adaptive capacity and intergenerational transmission of knowledge about the land, which is critical for sustainability and planning and environment. Education should focus on strengthening a sense of identity and local knowledge regarding respecting land and increasing education on climate and human impact. And social vulnerability needs to be considered in the design of climate change strategy. And finally, there's a continued need to consider the differential impacts of climate change on different individuals of various identities in order to create responsive adaptation plans, considering gender, culture, and other social categories is critical for enhancing adaptive capacity. Again, we want to turn it.
Just to say, I forgot. I was supposed we talked about which category this fit in, but on the livelihoods, one of the adaptations that was mentioned in the literature was that people were having to travel for work, so the fly in, fly out. So as the traditional resource sectors had declined, they've shifted to working in oil and gas elsewhere, or other fly in, fly out types of work. And then the gender implication of that has been an increased pressure in the household economy for the often women that are left behind. So that Darren talked about that as a result of some of these livelihoods. Just an example of a gender.
The next topic, which is governance and institutions. As far as governance and institutions are concerned, climate variability is creating new and unique challenges for Canadian public institutions that are responsible for responding to climate change impacts in rural and remote communities. Climate change is also exacerbating communities' ability to manage resources such as agricultural goods, energy, and water, as well as their capacity to monitor and evaluate the physical and environmental changes, which adds additional stressors to often already stretched local capacities. The gray literature, so institutions impacted by climate change, the gray literature suggests that all three levels of local, provincial, and federal governments recognize the need for increased support, but it typically takes the form of funding. So transferring money or down to the local level or to the community, but they often don't have the capacity to do anything with this. They don't have the expertise or the, they just don't have the expertise or the capacity to manage what is happening in their communities. So a review of federal documents suggests that departments such as Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change have historically been at the forefront of responding to these issues. And most recently through reports such as this national assessment that we are working on now, Canada and a Changing Climate. There's also a health assessment that is coming out related to climate change. And then, as Dr. Vodden had mentioned, the forestry report. Climate change impacts and adaptation also adds a pretty significant demand to already full plate of municipal councils and staff and Indigenous organizations. And so a part of the role of governance and institutions is the management of natural resources or resources in the community. So the literature suggests on that there are both challenges, but also opportunities depending on the region. So for rural and remote communities, when it comes to managing their resources, in terms of challenges, extreme weather events, such as floods, droughts, wildfires, and heat waves seem to be exacerbating food growers' abilities to predict climate impacts on crop yields, but it's also influencing the types of technologies and practices for implementing new management strategies within such a context. In British Columbia, warmer summers are putting pressure on local water supplies and making it more difficult to manage invasive species such as the Japanese pine beetle. In the more northern, climate change models for the Canadian prairies seem to suggest suggests that in general, the growing seasons will experience less frequent but larger precipitation events. And those are going to lead to more frequent spring flooding and a new climate regime that will require more proactive water management to ensure the availability of adequate supplies at optimal times in order to support and sustain agricultural production. In the more northern regions, the literature suggests that communities are faced with challenges related to energy access and supply, including things such as high transportation costs or lack of transportation infrastructure at all, as well as health risks associated with these communities' dependencies on fossil fuels. All of these changes and pressures call for responses from agencies involved and often a more collaborative approach to coping and adapting, including knowledge management and monitoring and anticipating changes. So some adaptation responses that have emerged are, well, academic institutions. In the literature, it seems academic institutions appear to be playing a larger role in pairing up with the rural and remote communities in order to help address issues of capacity and scientific and policy-related expertise. There's knowledge, so creating space for the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge into data collection, monitoring and evaluation, and wildlife management. There's also been the development of best management practices. And although these have, well, from the literature, it appears that they have mainly been used to reduce agricultural effects on the surrounding environment. The literature suggests that sometimes communities have augmented the design of these practices in order to improve their adaptive capacities of producers to deal with climate variations. From the gray literature and consultations, the FCM regional climate advisors and funding programs, including support for asset planning and management, climate change adaptation and mitigation planning and staff. And so, for example, the Municipalities for Climate Innovation Program is a 5-year, $75 million program designed to encourage Canadian municipalities to better prepare for and adapt to the new realities of climate change, as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The program is delivered by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and it's funded by the Government of Canada.
The last thing I wanted to say, just speak to, was that we do, as I mentioned already, we do recognize that these areas are interconnected. So we'll just sort of wrap up with that, and then if you have any final comments. But we will be reflecting on the interconnection between these themes and also the multiple stressors that rural communities are facing, and also the resilience of rural communities, which I think is another theme that cuts across all of the individual themes, is that there are adaptations happening, there are innovations happening, and we're very conscious of the kind of negative discourse around both rural and climate change. And yes, there are challenges and threats, but and yes, there are capacity issues in rural communities, but there are also strong social capital, innovations, and lots of strengths that we can draw from in our rural regions. So that's a theme that we want to sort of cut across all the themes, but then to emphasize again in a kind of conclusion where we talk about the state of adaptation and also the interconnections across these issues. So, and talk about some of the opportunities, such as the new shifts in our economies that we've discussed, the ability to create new adaptation tools, education and awareness efforts, and planning processes that can help us to adapt to a changing climate, while not being naive and recognizing that there are also certainly challenges to be faced, and that some of the solutions that are proposed are very expensive, for example. So it's not only human and planning capacity, but it's also limited financial resources. And we have to think about what can be done given those realities, certainly. So that's kind of how we thought we would conclude the chapter. Our emails are here, so I'll put that up maybe while we conclude in case you want to take down our email addresses. And I guess we all have each other on the app anyway, if you're here at the conference and not for those online. And there's also an ability to learn more about the assessment process through this link. And you can also add your own comments and input that way.
Sure.
Well, thank you,
Well, thank
very
you very
much for
much.
participating.